usually think of violence as something that explodes into view. A war, a riot, a gun, a crime. Something that breaks the normal flow of things. But the longer you look at the world, the harder it gets to hold on to that story. Because a lot of the violence shaping our lives does not interrupt the system. It runs through it. It shows up in schools, in borders, in paperwork, and who gets stopped, questioned, or waves through.
What we've proven is that the hidden variable is violence.
Welcome to In Substantia. I'm Gabor Farkas. My guest today is Guillaume Soto-Mayor. Before he started writing about systems, markets, and power, Guillaume spent years asking a simpler question about responsibility.
I think the best way to define yourself is by your intention, right? It's pretty much the only thing that you control.
That question about intention eventually leads to his book, The Economies of Violence. But before we get there, I wanted to slow things down. Before talking about markets or structures, we start with where he comes from, with the experience that shaped how he sees violence in the first place. School, migration, education, and the early moments where harm shows up quietly long before anyone calls it violence. That is what this first part is about. Guillaume, before we begin, I'd like to give you the floor. How would you introduce yourself in your own words, not the ones found in biographies or academic pages?
Thank you very much, first, Gabor, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to be a part of this wonderful podcast that is In Substantia. I think the best way to define yourself is by your intention, right? It's pretty much the only thing that you control. So my intention, my nationality has been given by, to me, part of my identity as well. But my intention has always been and continues being to address the evolution and the impact of violence within our society. I have in my heart the belief that nothing can be achieved in terms of enhancement of our living condition, in terms of enhancing, the human dignity within our societies, the respect of others, peace between people and nations, if we do not address where violence is coming from, who are the main protagonists, and how it actually shapes, indeed, as you mentioned, different parts of our societies. And so this has been always my intention. In order to achieve that, I have researched violence. I've been a field researcher and I continue being so. I analyze the structures, the dynamic, the actors of violence, especially across Africa, Europe, and a bit in the Middle East. But these dynamics, of course, are global. And so I've been doing, this work now for the last 15 years or so. And part of my life in the last 3 years, through the presidency of an endowment fund called Egregor, a philanthropic endowment fund, has been to respond to that violence with a concrete action, which is trying to recreate tangible hope that other futures exist beyond violence, based on the concrete action that field actors, again, associations, startups are doing, which we support greatly with Egregor and the wonderful team that compose it. So really, all of my work has been trying to understand violence better and attempting to respond to it by something concrete via the action we pursue at Egregor.
Thank you. I always find that the way someone chooses to describe themselves tells us as much about their work as any title ever could.
Yeah, and one part of my work, perhaps that I did not mention here, but for me that is as important along the way, is the transmission part. And I've been teaching, and I've had the luck of having incredible students as well for the last 7-8 years now at Sciences Po in Strasbourg, notably, but in different masters across Europe. And this has been an incredible part, also an incredible journey in my life. Why? And I just want to mention this quick point here, because when I was a student at Sciences Po or at Oxford, I noticed that we weren't told about violence. We really weren't prepared to it. And we are living in what I describe as a violent, quite a violent world in many aspects. Informational, as you know very well, and economical again, and being, if you want to create a company and be competitive, if you want to be a politician or have any kind of meaningful impact within your administration or work in medias, you will be in one way or another confronted to violence and their actors. And so I believe as well that, this we weren't given the keys, the kind of the glasses to even look at it in the proper eyes from a historical perspective and a more contemporary one. And so as such, we weren't given the right tools to address part of the complexity and survive it without too much anxiety. And so being able actually not only to address it, but to overcome it and be actors in this world. And this is why, I continue teaching as much as I can, and I absolutely love doing it. So this was just a quick compliment.
Well, thank you. I have to admit, because I like to give credit where credit is due, that I heard about you listening to a very good podcast called Sismic, which is in French, and he touches on very interesting issues, and I like the way he does that. So if anyone wants to look him up, Sismic is a very interesting podcast.
Wonderful podcaster, absolutely.
So when you look back to your life, what were the first signs that you saw the world differently, that you were attentive to power, fairness, or injustice in a way others perhaps weren't?
I had a very powerful moment in my elementary school when, and I know sometimes things traces back quite deeply, and this was one of it for me. A bit many. It was when we received in my class children escaping the wars from the Balkans, which also have greatly, touched and affected Switzerland through the immigration waves that arrived, notably in the 90s. But it also was the case in France. And I remember, not only the despair in the eyes, the profound traumas that these children were having to face on a daily basis, from their concentration attempts when they were just trying to concentrate on an exercise in mathematics or history, but also, the traumas that they had to face on a daily basis, trying to address all of the difficulties of the French administration to get recognized status, to get housing support, etc., and living in utter poverty even within our society. And so we had developed a number of solidarity initiatives to support them. But this was very powerful to me because I had a sensation at the time that there were some things around, them being forced to move from their homes, from the journey that also brought them from their homes to us, and then from the ways they were treated that weren't fully normal, and that weren't just anecdotal, but were perhaps originating for something a bit larger, something more political, from more geopolitical. And it is perhaps one of the key moments where I started to get interested, but by what was happening beyond my sole person or my close family.
There's a lot to say about that, and maybe we'll touch on it during our conversation. What comes to mind when you say that is the treatment that Syrian refugees receive now in comparison to the way that the Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed, especially in France. There's a tremendous difference in the way they are treated, the conditions under which they are sheltered. It's ridiculous and it's very sad.
Yeah, absolutely, Gabor. And if you don't mind me reacting on that quickly, and we could expand that, to the Sudanese, to the Eritrean, Ethiopian, Afghans, that continue fleeing, even some of the Iraqis, etc. What I keep saying to some of my, European counterparts when it comes around this debate is that what they are seeing beyond any kind of moral duty, beyond any kind of moral stance or values, is, sorry, mind my language, absolutely stupid on a pragmatic level. Why? Because if we keep these people at that level of disrespect in terms of their capacity to heal their traumas, for instance, to also be a contributive part of our societies. A quick note: a refugee, an asylum seeker in France, while doing the procedure, is forbidden to work on a legal stance. How counterproductive is that?
It is the same in Switzerland, as you might know.
Exactly. Over half of this population have high university diplomas. So we are not talking about people doing, just here as to take advantage of our state, of our social welfare, etc., etc. They are people that also are culturally, humanly, economically net positive contributors, and every single study have proved it to our society. But by continuously putting them into a poverty loop, into a vulnerability loop, both at physical, financial, and mental point of views, we put them like automatically in the hands of exploitation circles, of exploitative criminals and bad entrepreneurs or economic actors that will take advantage of them, that will also perhaps awaken some of the traumas that they already have endured. And so you create then, not only you don't benefit from their net positive contributions to our societies, but also you create additional costs. And I know a lot of our decision makers now only think about costs and benefits. So I'm trying to use their language. You create an additional cost because in terms of health costs, in terms of eventually security costs. And so this is, again, utterly counterproductive. And at the end of the day, it shows how a political stance, because it is just a political choice, can really create such a difficult and again counterproductive dynamic for our societies.
Yeah, I fully agree. If you don't mind, Guillaume, I'd like to stay with you for a moment before we move to ideas to understand how your path between places and histories shape the way you see the world. That's a very important aspect. I mean, you're the guest, and I think that understanding why you see things the way you see them can be understood through your journey. So, whether through family ties or upbringing or personal experience, the question of identity seems to be important preoccupation. How do that perspective live within you today?
No, it has a central part, in my daily life, also because, again, it is a way that I engage with the world. It is a way that I engage with not only different cultures, but also different upbringing, different life path. And I believe that, nobody is a monolithic identity. And so we have been shaped, and we are continuously shaped, socially, not racially. We are shaped by not only the people that, but also our different origins, in our daily reflexes, in the way we host, in the way we cook, in the way we travel or conceive life and relationship to our family, to our elders, to different encounters, to tradition or money. And so, yeah, I know that it has a central part in my personality, in the way that I have also, grown as a human, as a professional. I left home when I was 16, and I did it, with confidence, because I came from a family that had traveled also, that had already, left their homes, on several accounts, from North Africa to France, from France to Switzerland, from Switzerland to France, etc., etc. And so I think it gives you a different mindset. And just for the anecdote, my sister and brother are also, with their life partners, also from different origins. My wife is Portuguese, and they all live, abroad in different parts of the world. And while we remain very closely attached to Switzerland and to France, we are all, so open to different cultures, also embedded in them, and taking, I think, we have a quite, I would say, biological, morphological relationship to this environment. And so I know that this has, again, for instance, had a really great impact on the fact that I absolutely adore that my second home, living in Senegal, has been absolutely central in my life, and that my identity and my upbringing made me more suited, perhaps, for this life and for this experience. And so, yeah, I believe that this identity is central right now in who I am and will continue being.
So, when we think about history, you mentioned your dual nationality and your wider identities. But when we think about history, France's colonial past and Switzerland's long posture of neutrality often appears as moral opposites. Yet there's also a quieter, more hidden violence in Switzerland's own history. How do these two legacies coexist in your mind? I mean, do they coexist at all? And what have they taught you about responsibility and justice?
It's a very interesting question because I don't live with this path in me, and I'm in many ways connected to both of these issues, both on the human and professional, level. And I have, let's say, let's start with Switzerland, for instance, the fact that the Swiss wealth comes, from uh, always directly connected to different economies of violence during the Second World War and after is, something that I wouldn't say define my identity, but something that I address, however, with frankness and with transparency. And I think this is, like a critically important part that I believe many of our leaders right now are not able to do with simplicity. And it also comes back to the colonial past of France. There are many aspects of that colonial past that France remains absolutely unable to face. The Algeria colonization and the absolute horrors that France did around that time, the massacres in Madagascar, even the Tiaroy massacre in Senegal, that France right now finally is starting to recognize after decades of procedures. There are still many aspects of our colonial history, of our even colonial legacy, outside and inside of France, that we are not facing with, again, with simplicity. And they are, extremely complex issues. However, they are just a recognition among at least the people that I know who are, suffering or still connected to these issues in the countries or in the diasporas of former, for instance, French colonies, that would simply like, friends to be transparent, doing the obvious in a way.
Mhm.
And they are not expecting more than that for the vast majority of people that I know. And I would say that I stand with them. I believe that there is, it's not weakness to recognize responsibility. It's no, weakness to be transparent on again a former legacy, and to establish, based on the, so what you learn from it and what you build from it, be accepting that it is a part of who we are as, a French nation as well, and building on that, on the contrary. And it's a really difficult work in terms, again, of our identities, in terms of building common values and projections around human dignity, respect of others, that could also, emerge in contrast of that past. And that's my point. You can also, being able to make your aggiornamento on your past and being transparent about it, and facing it, I think, with honesty, brings you that clarity also to project differently. While when you actually are, as French is doing, like some of the French legislators are doing right now with Algeria, or have done in the past with many aspects of our, of our past, with doing this kind of in between, is not helping, I think, building common projections that can gather people in the different parts of our societies.
I think that sometimes what shapes us most is what we're never told. And every family carries silences and inherited stories. What kinds of memories or perhaps absences made you curious about the way societies justify or conceal harm?
That's a very good question, because I had the opportunity when I was a child to spend some time with my great grandmother. She was born in Algeria, in the region of Oran, in the west side of Algeria, and she had a very, close relationship with, and a very fond memories of these regions. Where she, when she moved to France, she left a lot behind, and that detachment and all of the memories around it were very much concealed in my family until a couple of years back. And that past also, and the fact that this past was concealed detached part of my family to our heritage when others actually went to look for it. And this is where this concealment of identities can have different effects, right? There are things that live within you and you don't understand why. You arrive in a place and you feel home immediately, and then you realize that actually there are many things in the way you move. You see, I don't know if you can see on the camera, I move my hands all the time when I speak, and this also comes from a heritage. And then when you arrive, when I arrive in Algeria, in Morocco, when I see people doing the same thing, it's a very small detail, right? But I feel home in many ways. And in the way you eat, in the way you receive, in the way you interact with, like with the centrality of family as well is not exactly the same than other friends that you know, and then you understand the differences. You understand, what makes you who you are as well. In as you said at this very start, in the untold, in the untold part of your being, of your heritage. Now it starts to illuminate. It starts to make sense. And so this is where I believe that giving a proper value to this different heritage, understanding that we are not 100%. I have a good friend who told, who is French Algerian, who told me I am 200% identity, So he told me, once he had a critique of someone saying that he needed to be, you could only be a 100% something, so you could not be French and Algerian, you cannot be French and Chinese, you could, or French and Cambodian, you needed to be, it could be only one blood, one identity, one thing. And he told me, no, I always have been 200%. And I live through my two identity fully in many parts of who I am. And so I believe that a lot can be achieved in our society if we give room for that. I know sometimes it's complex. It doesn't mean that building a nation around that is easy. But then there are many other things beyond, this identity that can also shape it, around which we can gather, and not only football. There are many things, in our social contract that are supposed to gather us, each other.
That's true for nationality. Unfortunately, I found it impossible to reconcile for when you have a darker complexion, when you have an African or a black father and a white mother, you're black. And you cannot be half white, half black, or you can not be both. You are defined by the way you look. And when you're not white, you're different. You are not white. And you can be both Senegalese and French. You can be both Hungarian and Vietnamese. You cannot be, you can be, but you're not considered by one person who is purely white when you're mixed race equal.
Would you consider then that perhaps it is a two-way street? It is your personal identity and it is the way the society reflects on it and the impact of this reflection on yourself. And so this is a two-way. And I believe that a lot of that, comes from, again, the way society reflects. And so that comes also from the way the society is being constructed. And that comes back to the social contract. Let's say, in the US or in England, for instance, in certain Anglo-Saxon, with their many complexities and problems, the fact that you are black or métis or from mixed origin doesn't define your nationality appartenance, or much less.
It doesn't define anything. It just defines the way you look.
It does, but then sometimes the appartenance to a social group will then be also very much reflected on your self-identity. And this is where the complexion in for instance in France, to my point of view, lies at the moment, is that this differentiation, this around the color of the skin, around the religion, around the origins, are constantly being reflected to the people in question, constantly. And I don't suffer from it on a great basis. I had once or twice when I was doing a French tradition and going to the street to demonstrate on not only in certain issues. I had some actually policemen publicly calling me by, I would say, racial terms around my supposed Arabic appartenance. And so this has been a very rare occasion. I have very close friends who, during job interviews, when they apply for a house, when they apply for a credit in the bank, when they interact with law enforcement officers, when they arrive in a nightclub, etc., etc., are constantly reminded about, their apparent identity based on their skin color, based on their thing. And so that then creates, an identity back. And Gabor, let's go back to perhaps, like economic issues. This has a political one. This has a huge economic impact on France, completely untold. There's been one investigation 2 years ago that touched a bit around that issue. It is the depletion of talent that France is suffering because of that. Many people that I know, extremely talented, raised and bold in France, wanting to create companies, apply to position in France. Because of that, constant reflection and all of the inequalities and discrimination that we're facing because of it, went to New York, to Casablanca, to Thailand, to Dubai, to start their lives with their companions, because they basically could not they could not live in the society anymore. They really weren't feeling good, and it was a very tough departure for many of them. They left a lot behind, and it is a huge pool of talents, of culture, of social links also that were lost because of it.
Do you think forgetting can itself be a form of violence?
No, no. I believe being forced to forget, being forced to annihilate part of who you are, part of your history, of your legacy. Yes, I don't believe that forgetting in itself would be, because it doesn't really comply with the definition of what violence entails.
How did violence become a question that mattered to you, not just intellectually, but personally?
My father is a pediatrician. He's a child doctor, and he was living through, and he continues to, because he's still, he was going through a lot of very difficult stories, of all kinds of violences, sexual, physical harassment against children. That very often, even when we were quite young, he was telling us, and because also he needed perhaps also a little space to express some of the hardships that he was experiencing on a daily basis. And so I became more aware of that, and on a quite young age. And I saw as well, on several accounts, children being molested or harassed. And that became, an undergoing theme that remains so in my life, which was, if I summarize the question, first, how can we tolerate that as a society, and do so little about it? And on a more, I would say, projective question, how do we think? And it remains really a question that remains unanswered to me right now. How do we think that we can project anything positive within our society to build, how can we build a good future for the next generations, not addressing this issue? Let me just remind one or two numbers, Gabor, if I may. We estimate in France that around between 1/3 and 1/4 of children, can you imagine, are being right now harassed online. We estimate that between 1/8 and 1/10 of children suffer at some point physical and sexual violence, within during their upbringing. How do we estimate that with these traumas, with this violence that they suffered in their own flesh, that this won't impact the way these young people, as adults, will interact with the rest of the world, with their lovers, with their co-workers, with their friends, right? And so I don't believe that we can build a peaceful, more respectful, more dignified society if we don't address these issues. And I remain really profoundly shocked, at the way these issues are being treated by some of our politicians, by our medias, by our cultural sector. And I can, of course, mention the Depardieu story, the Morandini in France, and of course the ways, the Betaram scandal and the violence against children in private Catholic schools and other religious private schools were treated in France.
Likely that most of our English-speaking listeners won't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, sorry. To give one or two context, then Gérard Depardieu, the very famous French actor, who is, I think, quite renowned internationally, was caught on camera describing in utter sexual terms a 12-year-old child during a documentary, and is still, could not apologize for his comments, and was defended by many people publicly for it. The other one is a quite famous French journalist, Jean-Marc Morandini, who has been found to have conducted with the support of others, very likely in the continuity as well of other very famous French journalists and the French cultural personalities, different not only harassment but sexual exploitation of young men throughout their career, and are still within their current jobs, completely supported by their, by their par leur direction.
By the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yes, I have to say that the one that I found the most appalling is the reaction of the former French Prime Minister to the scandal in this Catholic school, and the way he addressed the issue. That was really appalling.
But Gabor, the French president Emmanuel Macron publicly supported Gérard Depardieu following the scandal.
Yes.
And then following indeed the scandal around the schools, which is indeed one of the most appalling one, because it really showed a systemic, problem. It wasn't one school. It's an incredible amount of school. It's an incredible number of victims that have come publicly, to denounce this system. Within that scandal, they found the immense courage. The prime minister, who was directly concerned by the school in question, who directly, very likely protected, and who he supported in many ways, financially, publicly, judiciary levels, himself having some of his own children within that school. And his wife also directly involved in it. He not only downplayed for the voice of the victims, he then, and within his government, still hasn't done any substantive action to address the systemic failures in the control of the different schools to protect children effectively, and then to give proper support to the collective of victims, and to then also put this issue as, again, a central one, and not as an anecdotal one. And this is the most critical thing, is by, again, trying to downplay the sexual violence that these children had been living. Not only did they created additional mental violence against these victims, and additional suffering, but also they incited other children, other victims to come forward, and finally also did not create a proper space, a proper dynamic to enhance the protection of children within our societies. So for me, this is the paragon of catastrophe when it comes, and of scandal when it comes to the protection of children against all forms of violence.
I'd like to also just quickly say that the Gérard Depardieu case was appalling, but he wasn't alone in it. There was also this very famous and very talented writer, Yann Moix. And given his personal history, it was difficult to comprehend why he wasn't able to distance himself from what has surfaced. Anyway, let's set that aside. It's very sad. I'm sure that similar issues exist in not just in France. They exist in different parts of the world. So especially in the US, where what's going on in the US, and that's also appalling. Your work crosses Africa, Europe, and the digital world. How have your encounters with people or communities living with violence shaped the way you think about systems and their consequences?
Thank you for this question. It has shaped, the way that I believe society evolve. I believe that, violence is a central element, and not only in the ways our social contracts were built, where our violence take their legitimacy from in existence, in order to, the main social contract is, the guarantee, or at least the promise, that our governments and our leaders will protect us from different harms and dangers. This is also why the previous topics really shock me also that much. And the other thing that I believe had been looked really deeply into these issues for a long time is that, again, it has been the hidden story of the ways, also social relationships are being built from, again, on a historical heritage. We talked about colonization before, but we of course can touch around here as well patriarchy and our gender relationships. We can of course touch upon different aspects of the ways our societies were built, in again shaping human relationship between different social groups, the ways also, as I told you, our states are being built. And finally, I believe it is a very important element to describe and understand better our geopolitics or geostrategy. So the ways states and different actors, kind of ruling our world, if I summarize it in a crude way, are interacting within one another. So their capacity, their capacities, because it is often different leverages, to use violence or to hold it is determinant, to understand the place that they have, the capacity of action and of power in their power strategies right now in this world. So that applies not only for the US or China, but that applies as well to middle powers. That applies as well to other kind of actors, among which, transnational organized crime, some religious actors, some multinational companies, right? So the main actors that are shaping the ways our, again, our economy works, our social relationship are being conceptualized and implemented, and the ways our politics is being run, I believe are, predominantly, or at least centrally, being shaped by the ways they hold and use violence in different ways and scenarios.
You've spent time in very different institutions and disciplines. What have those experiences taught you about how knowledge itself can either reveal or disguise power?
I believe as well that the question that you currently ask is intrinsically correlated to the one that you were asking before, in understanding the different side of violence, in the sense to understand, on the one hand, the one that hold and detain it, and the one that also suffer sometimes from it, right? And if you look at this reality across Africa, the Middle East, or Europe, you find that the perpetrator, the holder of violence on an economic or political or geopolitical stance, but also within the knowledge around those issues, right? And the ways to address it and the victims of it are very often quite similar, even on a historical perspective. So who do suffer right now the most of a lack, not only of knowledge, but representation of violence? People that perhaps do not have as well the same place to talk about the violence that they suffer. They are the same ones that suffer the most from it in terms of social, political, economic violences, right? Exploitation of resources, different conflict and conflictuality. And they are, again, the same ones that very often do not have a central role, a central place within different academic, realms, being anthropological, economic, criminological, to define also, this or orientate some of the works of, those sciences. And let's take an example around health. If you look at, in terms of research, what are even within what the so-called global south, and I put brackets around that because I don't really like this term, but what are the main diseases that are currently being researched, or within the global north? Where is the money going to? Very often it touches upon, diseases that are primarily concerning the health and the well-being of population in the global north rather than in the global south, right? And when it comes even to skin diseases, to cancers, or specific disease that touch people within the global south, money is extremely scarce. And I can give you a concrete example that I touched upon for a very long time, and I continue being scandalized about. Whereas in Africa, the drug consumption and especially consumption of counterfeit medicines continue rising on extremely high levels, and is right now thriving in many places in many parts of the continents. There still, Gabor, hasn't been one epidemiological study conducted by even international partner or financed by international partner to monitor, the consumption patterns and the consequences on the health of people across the continent. So there is zero data on large scales. There's been some small studies, but on even regional or continental scales, absolutely none. Which basically means that the consequences, for instance, of tramadol. Tramadol is a synthetic opioid.
I'm allergic to
That
it.
is,
Unfortunately, I discovered that.
I'm sorry to hear that, because that can be very dangerous. And when during surgeries, for instance, in Europe, we use tramadol in case of extreme pain, right? We use it at 100 milligram. Across Africa, it is consumed between 250 very often and 300 or 350 milligram doses, and several pills a day. So, and the consequences of tramadol consumption when it comes to sleep, to hunger, but also to the dysfunctioning of many organs has never been studied, not a single time. We conducted with my former boss, David Desadifar, at UNODC, a study around this issue in 2015. And there's been many articles following that on the topic. There still hasn't been a single large research on, again, consumption patterns. So when it comes to knowledge, right, this is also very apparent that, again, in terms of what really matters in people's living condition, in their, again, daily lives and sufferings that they are enduring, the people that suffer the most from all kinds of violences, again, gender, environmental, social, etc., are the same ones that are underrepresented in shaping, conducting, or being, the main beneficiary of knowledge and science.
Yes. There are so many issues that we could cover in relation to fairness and how data and research is being distributed. It is appalling. I'd like to go back very quickly to something you said before in relation to the people affected by violence and how little opportunities they have to talk about it. The thing is, sometimes you are living in terrible conditions and you don't realize that they are terrible because it is your normal. And this is your everyday life. And because it is your everyday life, it's very difficult for you to fathom there is a different way that you can live. So it is your normal. And it is not until you come to across someone whose normal is very different that you realize it's not him who's lucky, it's me who is unlucky, or her, or they, to be correct nowadays. It's when you
Absolutely,
grow up
Gabor.
in a family where there is an abusive parent, it's your normal.
Yes.
You don't know it.
Yes.
You just realize later that your normal was not normal.
And you know why it matters so much what you're saying, Gabor? Sorry to interrupt. Why it matters so much? It relates to one issue we have talked about already and another we haven't. One is education, and the fact that, again, within education realm, you don't centralize violence or normalize violence as being a positive, in terms of how you define yourself, how you engage with others, and how you engage with the world, right? And that is central to, or supposedly central within our educative systems. However, in many educative systems within the world, violence continue being normalized. And the second thing is that actors of violence, religious, criminal, for instance, but also many political, have understood that perfectly and are normalizing violence against the other, within very Manichaean terms, against the enemy or against, the threat, against women. And so when you look at the centrality, and I have investigated these issues for a very long time, of violence within the educative schemes of the Islamic State or Al Qaeda in the schools that they run around the world, you understand that for these children, as you absolutely rightfully said, will be completely normalized until they will actually be confronted to something else that, with time and proper care, will become the new norm, around which they will also have a place, because they will also have an identity, a valorization, and existence within that other educative space. The second area beyond, school and education is culture. And this is where, as well, we underestimate, Gabor, the impact that the control of actors of violence, again, of the cultural space, can have within our society. As you know, I'm sure, Hollywood was, from the get-go, from the start, in the 20s and 30s, directly connected to the American Italian mafia, who financed a lot of it. And this is not, again, anecdotal or unthought. This came from the get-go as a very powerful strategy, as an economic investment, of course, that brought them a lot of money, but also as a way to shape, the perception of mafias and organized crime, but also of violence that you normalize. And let's give you the example of Tony Montana, the movie Scarface, that I hope some of our audience know. Scarface and Tony Montana, they remain around the world an example of success within the youth today, of what, again, a success should and must be. Look at the investment of, there is right now a very powerful criminal organization in Marseille called the DZ Mafia. There is an investigation that came out a couple of days back in France about their involvement within the music industry, that they control, a considerable amount of label. Why? Because this is also a powerful tool to shape culture. Look at the Sinaloa cartels and the Mexican cartels and the involvement within the music industry in Mexico. The fact that they also glorify themselves, but also violence as a way to be shaped. And it's the same with, Indian mafia in Bollywood, or Nigerian crime syndicate in Nollywood in Nigeria. It is very important to understand that cultural norms, in many ways, through music, through movies, through media, in a large sense, okay, is detrimental to, again, shape what we consider being normal or not. And the ways to finish on that, and to expand a little bit, the ways that our, political class, I would say our intellectual elite, has normalized many aspects of violence or tried to downplay them within in the last, decade. And of course, we can think here about the genocide in Gaza, right? He's been incredible in that regard, right? Because it has normalized a certain vision of the human being, a certain vision of violence that I believe is extremely, extremely dangerous, and yeah, needs absolutely to be addressed collectively.
Which thinkers, mentors, or experiences have left the deepest mark on the way you approach violence, and which have you come to question over time?
Oh, I've had, I think, three. I had a lot of, mentors and inspirations. The most important one that I had professionally is a man named David Izadifar, that I mentioned already, who was my boss at the United Nations, and really a mentor. He's someone that gave me the tools, and I would say, the intellectual openness to address violence from an interdisciplinary point of view, right? So to look as violent dynamics and the power of violent actors through different lenses, and understanding that we could not understand them without those, economic, social, historical, criminological outlook. So we needed to have these different approaches to understand them, to understand the influence they had in a community, to understand why they were the predominant actor in this territory, where they were, again, coming from, and why they invested in that activity rather than this one, connected, for instance, to, as we will perhaps talk a bit later, economic, value chains, economic competitiveness, and key productions in certain areas. Yeah. So this needed to be analyzed from different standpoints. So he helped me a lot with that. Then, in terms of literature, I would say that the books from Maria Vargas Llosa, um, really shaped a lot my my views around violence, different of his book. And philosophically, I had a lot, but it's difficult to choose one.
Well, you don't have to choose one.
One of
You can mention more
one
than
of
one.
the yeah, of course. I had a thinker called Jean-François Guéraud on the studies of organized crime that had a very important part. I would say Freakonomics as well, from Levitt, and Divide from Jason Hickel. And I would say overall also the books from Frantz Fanon. And finally, I had several authors from Senegal, someone called Ken Bukul. The last one that had a really, really strong impact on me, I would say, was Michael Sandel and all of his work around justice and meritocracy. I think that this had a very, very, very strong impact on who I am for one critical reason. It helped me understand the fallacies around the meritocracy discourse and the centrality. It made me look at one critical aspect both of the stories and the projections that actors of violence were successfully giving to many communities around the world that was making them so appealing, which was a sense of justice, in terms of economic justice, social justice, identity, etc. And on the other hand, the incapacity of many and so-called actors of progress to provide people, to respond to people's aspirations for justice, for fiscal justice, social justice, etc., etc. So Michael Sandel helped me a lot in that regard.
I'm not familiar with his work, but I will look him up.
No, he's sensational.
I was thinking of how influential Hannah Arendt was on me, the banality of evil, and that also implies the banality of violence. And yeah, well, those are things that have shaped the way I understand and look at things. Before we turn to the book, what part of your work or thinking feels most alive for you right now? The question or intuition you keep coming back to?
I would say that I come back to three critical ideas. One, that models of transition, the so-called just transition, social, economic, etc., environment to address climate change, for instance, have a critical, dead end, or have a critical shortfall, which is their incapacity to understand and look at the impact of violence in both, like understanding it as a nuisance capacity to, their project, understanding that you have structures and actors of violence in place, powerful, with capacity to harm these projects on many different levels: disinformation, physical attacks, economic competitiveness, etc., etc. And that these actors are also critically powerful in, again, as we told already a little bit, shaping identities. And that without understanding this dimension, again, and we are seeing a lot of different signals around that within our societies, if we do not address the fact that violence become the goal, become a key element of people's self-esteem, right? Of their projection and engagement with the world and with people around them, the justification again of gender violence, of that is rising again in many parts of the world, the vision against children, against violence against children, violence against the environment, etc., etc. Well, if we do not understand and address those, it will be very difficult to create the right space, the right, I would say, social reflexes, the dialogue, just a common place where you, me, and others will be able to address the key challenges of our time and that our societies are currently experiencing, right? So this is the two perhaps key dimension, and a third one, which is the connection between violence and justice. So I do believe when I'm looking around the world, and this is perhaps where some of the thinkers that I mentioned to you a bit before, I have my small differences, right? Because if I look on a 25-year perspective, let's say, or 15 at least, at the 99% movement in Wall Street, the Arab Springs, the social movements in Nigeria, in Kenya, more recently Madagascar and Morocco, or in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Indonesia, or in the Yellow Vest in France. When I look at all of these movements, I see a commonality, which is, again, one, aspiration for justice, fiscal, social, again, enhancement of living conditions through better and more just access to social services, to a better redistribution of the wealth, etc., etc. But also justice in the sense of existence within the system. So a recognition that the people that demonstrated have a rightful place to exist within our society, to be recognized, to be even seen, okay, when they have been literally forgotten for a very long part of our of the last decades, or at least taken either for granted by some of the social democrat or the some of our elites. And I believe that the Trump vote, for instance, was very, very, very strongly influenced by that. And a lot of the just research that I have conducted tends to confirm that. Even the Brexit vote, it was when you look at the Trump vote, I like to point out that statistic, which is that a really large part of the American population believed, despite the dozens of trials that he suffered, that he was the best choice to fight corruption. Can you believe that? It's a YouGov poll of late 2024. It was a better choice than the Democrats and Biden. And why? Or Harris? Because most of the American people considered that Trump and around him were more suited to fight the system, to fight, an intellectual, elitic, technocratic bubble in Washington, taking advantage of them, manipulating, exploiting the states and all of the resources against them, putting them under the rug, literally forgetting about their existence and their well-being and their interests. And that is considered and has been very successfully branded by Trump and his team as being corruption. It is the corruption of the existing system. And that system, denomination, you find it in Senegal, in the street, you find it in Indonesia, you found it as well in Tunisia during the Arab Springs, in Sri Lanka more recently, or during the Yellow Vest in France. So I believe that this is absolutely crucial, and it really confirmed my instinct that we also need to look, if I summarize it, as of the violence of our, in terms of narrative, of epistemology, and of our social and political systems, of the ways that many people feel they have been left out and embezzled by these systems.
The problem with the voting system is that it's very difficult to measure. You can do polls, but do they really reflect what people think? I think it's a similar case to what happened during the presidential election in France. So to what extent are people voting for someone or against someone else? So in the case of the French election, they were voting not for Macron, they were voting against Le Pen. In the case of the American elections, were they voting for Trump or against Harris? Or against an idea that the Democrats were conveying that had to do with issues related to wokeness or similar issues. I mean, it's very difficult to establish that even if you go to polls, because what are they answering really? I don't know how reliable the polls are. They've been known to be falling short in their predictions. But let's turn to the book. We've already covered a lot of ground, and I mean, this was what drew me to you. So I'm really interested in diving deeper into things that are surrounding the book and what you talk about in it. So the title, "The Economies of Violence," is a striking combination of words. How do you understand that phrase? What makes violence an economy, and what kinds of exchanges or logics are we really talking about?
So most of the comprehension that we have around our economic system is that they are driven by markets, and in that markets by offer and demand. What we've proven in that book is that the hidden variable is violence. What actually shape economic markets and financial markets, both in terms of intention, but also in terms of key leverages that you can use to control and take the most out of them in perhaps the ways also that they have been structurally designed for, is violence within monopoly, monopolistic systems, but also within more competitive and more open one. What keeps you, in a monopolistic position is at some point the use of violence, right? What makes you in many markets, and we will be, I'm sure, able to give some example, competitive is violence within production, distribution, or selling, a part of the value chain. And so here, violence is considered both as a variable, understanding again what the ways economic market work beyond offer and demand, as a leverage, as a tool that economic actors can use to be dominant, to increase profitability, and as a structure. So, as a ways that, again, key parts, and perhaps even more globally, in the ways that our modern capitalistic systems work and have been shaped. So, it is, I would say, the three key dimensions.
Maybe violence functions as a currency, harm that buys order.
Sometimes. And so violence, of course, and this is, I would say, a subcomponent. It is very often the way that we look at it. Violence can be exchanged, can be bought, can be sold. But again, this is a really a sub part. So the ways that you think about here violence could be, for instance, mercenaries, or the use of, I would say, different cyber teams that will create, a harmful reputation for one of your competitor. Dispense disinformation, for instance, in order for you to get a competitive advantage during an acquisition of a competitor company, etc., etc. In many cases, you will have this kind of elements, and they will go beyond simply economic actors. It is also affecting, for instance, when you affect the reputation of another country, from which the economic, your economic competitor is a part of. You can also gain competitive advantages. So you have many ways around which effectively violence can be traded. But what we are talking here about is much more structural.
Okay, so what gave birth to this book? What question or unease pushed you to assemble it?
Again, can we understand our economic systems without understanding violence? We were a part of, so it is a collective book, and I must stress that out. It is a book that I directed, but it has absolutely incredible researchers that contributed to it from around this world, from Dr. Nazia Hussein, Dr. Luis Shelley, Professor Arturo Alvarado, David Ezadifar, and Julien Dechanet, and of course, Clotilde Champérache. So incredible group of people. And we were all part of a group from the Carnegie Endowment Foundation and the Maison Sciences de l'Homme, where we were studying, in different aspects, the centrality of violence within our societies. Again, from a memory aspect, from a more religious component, a more political one, and we had at that time a working group on the economies of violence that I created and then I led. And following that working group and the different exchanges we had, we published first, I would say, a dossier, a review for the International Journal of Criminology. And following that different papers that we published at that time, we then conducted this book project for Brill edition in the US. So this is pretty much how the book was born. And what we really wanted from the get-go was starting from an understanding of our economic system. So really measuring precisely where can violence, be seen as a variable, of our economic and financial system. Who are the main actors? How do they work? And case studies of that violence in key components and key parts of our societies. So this is a little bit the way we thought about this book. So from, again, the I would say the structure to the visibility.
Over the course of this first part, we have been talking about violence as something lived, something learned, something that gets passed along through families, schools, borders, and institutions. Not the spectacular kind, the kind that settles in quietly and starts to feel normal. And at a certain point in the conversation, something else starts to surface. Because if violence is learned, if it is normalized, if it shapes how people relate to authority, belonging, and power,
I believe that violence is a central element, and not only in the ways our social contracts were built.
Then it can just be a personal story, or even a social one, which raises a harder question. What happens when we stop looking only at individual lives and start looking at the systems those lives move through? We don't fully go there yet, but that question is already doing its work. And that's where the conversation continues in part 2.